I'm Tavis, Smiley. This is KBLA Talk 1580. Our phone number 1-800-920-1580, 1-800-920-1580. As promised, he's here. LAPD Chief Michael Moore has requested that the Los Angeles Police Commission reappoint him to a second 5-year term. Has he earned it? Does he deserve it? We will put that question, those questions, and more to Chief Moore right now as we interrogate respectfully and lovingly his record over these first 5 years. Chief Moore, it's an honor, sir, to have you in the studios of KBLA Talk 1580.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here.
Glad to have you. Glad we've got the hour. Let's jump and cover as much ground as we can. The obvious questions, as I said a moment ago, you've requested this second 5-year term. Let me start with this. Why do you want to do this for 5 more years?
Well, I think there's a tremendous opportunity that still remains, following a historic pandemic and accompanying with it a resurgence in violence, particularly gun violence and loss of life. Mm-hmm. I think there's an opportunity to see us out of this pandemic to support Mayor Bass and her agenda to get 47,000 people off the street and into homes, to restore our workforce, to rebuild us from the devastating impact of reduction of hundreds of personnel, which has really impacted our ability to provide the type of service and protections across our city. It's an opportunity to continue to build on our legacy of community policing and expanding the community safety partnership, getting additional sites, but more importantly, taking what we've learned from that initiative and spreading across the entire organization. Opportunity to modernize our technology further. While we've made progress these last 5 years, there's even more work to be done that allow our officers more time to be in the field, to have effective community engagement. So modernizing that legacy systems, updating those, planning for the World Cup in 2026, and even more importantly, the Summer Games in 2028 and the Paralympics. Succession planning, there's a lot to do. A lot's been done. Certainly our continued work and training, an emphasis on de-escalation particularly, to lower the use of force, particularly deadly force. Those are all ambitions that I started 5 years ago with a commitment to improve on. I think we've made marked improvements. We have seen, again, a historic event with this pandemic and also the outflows of the terrible murder of George Floyd and civil unrest. And while we've performed in those areas, I believe admirably, we've also had our missteps, personally myself. And I just have the energy and commitment and a belief that I can still make a difference. And for that reason, and I've applied, I had gracious permission of my wife, Cindy, and my family, for us to continue this work together and with the city of Los Angeles, and I'm excited for the opportunity.
It won't surprise you. There are some who would not use the word admirably to describe your first 5 years, and you were very honest and transparent a moment ago about referencing some missteps you made even personally. So we'll talk about that, and you've teed up a number of things in that first response that we're going to unpack over the course of this hour. And I thank you again at the start of this hour for the full hour to talk about some of these issues. You mentioned Karen Bass, Mayor Karen Bass. Now let me start with this. Mayor Bass asked the police commission, and this is, let me be clear, this is Garcetti's commission at the moment. She has not put her persons on the LA Police Commission as yet. So this is these commissioners were appointed by former Mayor Eric Garcetti. But the mayor asked early on for the commission to slow down this process. There could have been a vote on you, or the proceedings could have moved forward in this month of January. She asked for this process to slow down just a little bit. How did you read the mayor asking the commission to slow down the process of moving forward with perhaps a second 5-year term for you?
I read it with one of understanding. I think that the mayor is committed to the people of Los Angeles for this to be a safe city, for this to be a city that's protected by a police department that is mindful and respects its core values, its commitment to community policing, to policing the city in a way that is a shared responsibility. And in the selection of a reappointment of myself, I believe she wanted to ensure that the process was honored, where the commission reached out to the community, heard from all corners of the community, deliberated also in their conversations with me while we meet with the commission, or I meet with the commission on a weekly basis, both in open session and closed session, and there's a running tally, if you will, of their evaluation of me. I believe that she, again, asked the commission to observe the process to ensure that the public had faith and confidence that this was not a rubber stamp or some automatic matter, and that the entire city would have an opportunity to weigh in on this.
You didn't read that decision, though, as a rub by Mayor Bass against Michael Moore.
No, I think that, again, I look forward to continued deliberation by the board, including, I would expect deliberations to include some conversation by the president and so forth with Mayor Bass. And Mayor Bass and I, we've known each other a long time. She is a respected member of Congress that I worked with prior to even her announcement of pursuing a position as mayor of the city. We worked, she sought to get important reforms with the George Floyd bill. And we talked of also over the time regarding issues that are most impacting public safety here in Los Angeles. And with her appointment as her election as mayor, we now are working much more closely, frequently regarding issues of public safety, the tragic events that we saw or hearing about out of Memphis, how those might impact us here in Los Angeles, matters of homelessness or Inside Safe initiatives, how the department can support that without policing and being a needed front of that. As well as the reduction in gun violence and the host of other issues of what it takes to have a city of 4 million, a world-class city. How do we make it safer? And so this is a dynamic process with my reappointment. Her involvement as the chief executive, as the leader of the city, I respect her views and guidance with the foundation, with the police commission, and I look forward to remaining responsive to questions and concerns in the future.
Speaking of Memphis, breaking news here, which just came out a few moments ago, they have now indicted those 5 cops. We knew they'd been fired, but now they've been indicted. All 5 of those cops happen to be African-American. Tyree Nichols, of course, African-American, of course, dead now, deceased. But all 5 of those cops, we now know from reports, have in fact been indicted. More on that in the days ahead, in the hours ahead here on KBLA Talk 1580. But if you had not heard that, there were those officers who Chief Moore just mentioned have now been indicted. Let me just ask you. Let me just stay with this line of thinking on Mayor Bass for a second. Then we'll move to critique your first 5 years and why you again want this second 5-year term. Karen Bass, not unlike Eric Garcetti, and for that matter, every mayor prior to them, I had the honor of working for the late, great Tom Bradley, the first black mayor of this city, and I remember those days fondly, my time in City Hall. Of course, I was dealing with a guy named Daryl Gates at the time. We ain't going to talk about that today, but we had to deal with Daryl Gates during the Tom Bradley era. But every mayoral candidate says they want to add more cops to the beat. They want more cops. And I've always wanted to ask this question, and you're the right person to ask it of. Give me some sense of how long it takes from application to hitting the streets in the process of becoming a cop. And you see why I'm asking this. I'm asking because every time somebody runs, they promise, they commit, they want to put more cops on the street. But that doesn't happen overnight, but they make these promises. So tell me how long it is from application to being a cop on the street. How long is that process?
I can put it in 2 words: too long. Today's our process is today. It's a 7-step process from application to the various testings that you go through to qualify. It is a rigorous process. It's one that tests for not just emotional maturity and intelligence, but also there's a physical test, there's a psychological test, there's an interview that goes on, and certainly there is a personal history background investigation that must take place. Out of every 100 applicants, there's many desired to hold the responsibilities, the privilege of being a police officer. But out of those 100 applicants, 5 will actually make it to the academy. We're currently working with Dana Brown, who's the general manager of personnel department. They are actually the hiring authority for all city employees. So we look to them to complete that background process on our behalf, and then currently we're working with them to improve the timing. We'd like to hire officers from application to the academy seat for it to be less than 90 days. And she has moved mountains in order to achieve that. We're not there yet, but anyone who's listening today who wishes to join this department, whether it be a sworn or civilian member, and there's many professional classes that don't require you to wear a badge or carry a gun or be a police officer, but we're hiring on all those fronts. But particularly on the police officer side, if they'd like to have a job in 90 days, I need you, and we need you. And the city needs you, and we now have a fast track, if you will, policy and lane to hold you accountable to our standards. We will not bend our standards in this need for hiring, but also to do it in a way that we recognize people are looking for work, and we need to get you through the process as quickly as we can.
I try not to ask two questions at once, but let me do it now and get out of your way right quick so we can move forward. Number one, LAPD did, in fact, your comment notwithstanding, relax standards during the Bratton era. Number one, you were in that department then. Did you agree with the relaxation of those standards then, number one? And number two, if I'm black or brown, I hear your point saying the city needs us, but if I'm black or brown, given the way that many of us see LAPD behave, why would I want to be a member of LAPD?
Well, let me answer the first one for the last part first.
Mm-hmm.
I would hope that you'd want to join this department to make a difference, not only as far as leading a life of change, leading a life that matters, but also making a difference in your community and righting the wrongs of what this profession has, as in our past, left communities, particularly communities of color and in the African American community, with the sense that the policing is this oppressive force, a force that judges people by the color of their skin, judges them with stereotypes and bias. Being a member of this department from the inside out gets to affect that and gets to change that. So we are hiring. We believe today that the standards today are contemporary to our use. There are critics of those standards. I'm not exactly familiar with your reference to Chief Bratton, but I'll say today that, for instance, historically, 10, 15 years ago, an African-American male applying for this department would be turned away because of some past overdue bills, because they didn't have their car registered a year and a half, 2 years ago. And it wasn't just African-Americans. It was people of all walks, but particularly people that struggled to find meaningful employment for a host of reasons and had financial difficulties. We would screen them out. And in my view, that was inappropriate. And I say that because with 4 decades of experience, I've known officers that have experienced financial difficulties as a police officer. And as a police officer, we've retained them, and they've been damn good cops. But they've also had a divorce, or they've had some type of bankruptcy, or some type of failure in a part of their business or otherwise. And with those difficulties, we still retain them. And so I believe background standards should be reflective of the total individual and life experience and what they've actually done with when they've been set back. Lastly, the issue of cannabis. Again, you go back 10 years ago, adult use of cannabis was outlawed. Then it became slowly municipal purposes or medical purposes. And of course, today we know that the use of cannabis is handled much as the use of alcohol is, which is it can be abused, it can be misused. But our background standards, up to most recently, would still disallow a candidate who had consumed cannabis from coming on a job, particularly if they were most recently, say in the last 2 or 3 years, they had consumed it. Now I recognize that people experiment with drugs and particularly these cannabis and those types of narcotics at young ages and teenagers and maybe their early 20s. But our background standards, say just 5 to 7 years ago, would exclude them. Today, we believe that those individuals are deserving of being reviewed and understood. There is a zero tolerance for the use of cannabis when you're on the job. But if a person walks in today and applies for this position as an adult, they've used cannabis in a responsible way. They've not driven under the influence. They've not demonstrated dependency on that. Just like we would not hire an alcoholic, we're not going to hire a person who has a dependency on cannabis. But social use, responsible use are no longer disqualifiers. So that's the evolution of our backgrounds and our standards and what it means to be a police officer today.
So, speaking of being a police officer today, let me ask you a series of questions here. How might I frame this? Describe this as a conversation now about the behavior, oftentimes the bad behavior of LAPD cops. You suggested a moment ago that, that sometimes communities of color get a sense, that's your phrase, that we get a sense of how the department treats us. Well, Chief, respectfully, it ain't just a sense. The data is incontrovertible. Here's the data. 2022 was the most deadly year on record for police killings nationally, according to Mapping Police Violence. There were 14 officer-involved shootings by LAPD alone, 14. At least 2 pedestrians hit and killed during a high-speed chase in South Central, bringing that total number killed as a result of LAPD actions to at least 16. These are just raw numbers. Why then are so many people dying by police violence in Los Angeles?
So those are numbers that we pay close attention to, and in each instance in which a use of force occurs, regardless of its level, is investigated, and we dig in to determine whether the officer's action is reasonable, did they meet the standards and our expectations of training. An officer-involved shooting, of which we saw a reduction last year, 6 fewer officer-involved shootings than the year before, still below and below our 5-year average, and the 4th fewest number of officer-involved shootings since we've kept records, which we began records in 1990 and 1991.
Mm-hmm.
But still, 31 officer-involved shootings. You listed the ones that were fatal.
Mm-hmm.
We track every officer-involved shooting because the officer's intention is to stop the individual's actions. It may or may not result in a fatality. Regardless of whether it results in a fatality, the merits of whether or not that officer-involved shooting was within policy and was reasonable given the reverence for life and use of deadly force as a last resort, that bright line must be honored regardless of the outcome of whether we struck the individual, wounded the individual, or the individual died. The instances of violence in the sense of police responding and attempting to defend themselves and others in society today is a complex one. It's one that when we look at the total number of contacts, I earnestly and honestly believe that when we look at the millions of contacts police officers have in the streets just in Los Angeles, in the more than 100,000 arrests, that in those instances where we have to resort to force was about 2,100 times last year. Mm-hmm. And of those, the vast majority were bodily force. In the 31 instances in which we resorted to the use of force, there were some that were found out of policy. Now, some are still being reviewed to determine whether they're in or out of policy. I will not and cannot defend a use of force that has occurred that I have not fully reviewed all the facts and circumstances, and the final determiner is actually the Board of Police Commissioners. Mm-hmm. In 2021, where we have reviewed all of those shootings, nearly 1 in 3 were out of policy. And we took action, I took action, to hold those individuals accountable. Mm-hmm. And there is discipline behind an out-of-policy shooting. An officer can and has lost their job because of the abuse of their discretion and exercising deadly force in a manner that we find improper. So I do believe that it's a matter of transparency, that we tell the public how we are engaged in these uses of force. We provide all the evidence and allow them to also evaluate in their mind. And then we have a civilian oversight board that is made up, as you indicated earlier, Board of Police Commissioners appointed by the mayor, confirmed by the city council, that independently reviews and makes a final determination. Unfortunately and tragically, there are instances in American policing today where officers are killed. They're wounded, they're shot, they die as a result of trying to protect others and or enforce the law. Officers must have and they must have the ability to defend themselves and others in a violent society.
You mentioned transparency. I want to come to transparency in just a moment and whether or not you think LAPD is as transparent as they ought to be. I got some questions I want to ask you about that. But before I move to that, let me just ask you point blank. You mentioned Memphis, and I followed up with this update that those officers in Memphis now have all 5 been indicted for the murder of Tyree Nichols. But too often, whether it's Tyree Nichols, and that case was compared by Ben Crump, the attorney on that case, now to what happened to Rodney King at the hands of LAPD 30 years ago. Should cops be involved? Should armed officers be involved in pedestrian and traffic stops?
Yes, I believe that there are instances in which pedestrians, first of all, pedestrians make up a significant portion of the number of fatalities by speeding motorists, pedestrians that are in a crosswalk, attempting to just move across a intersection controlled, and they're struck and killed by a motorist. In fact, this morning, there was a press conference that Councilmember Mark Reese Harris-Dawson chaired, as well as our South Traffic Division enforcement officers, identifying an individual who ran a mid-phase red tri-light and struck a family simply moving across the roadway in South Los Angeles in a vehicle, killing a 13-year-old and I think it was an 8 or 10-month-old child. The unfortunate reality is that the governance of people and their conduct, enforcement plays a role in that. It's not the entirety, but the black and white fever, so to speak, that you get when you see a police officer and now you're checking your speed and maybe you're tapping the brakes is a result of the fact that enforcement does take place.
But something is wrong, though, Chief, when people end up in this city and beyond dead over a routine traffic stop because their tail light was out, their headlight was out, their plates were expired, and people end up dead.
So let me address that in 2 ways.
Sure.
First of all, Timothy McVeigh was speeding on Oklahoma Street outside of Oklahoma City after he had bombed that center. He was stopped for a speeding violation. We have seen minor infractions, including equipment violations, turn out to be individuals. Just the other day, a white van was stopped that inside contains an individual who's committed serious and violent crimes. And so there is a role for proactive policing and going out and in a measured and reasonable sense conducting enforcement. Now, this last year, the department entered into established a pretext stop policy to address the true and accurate prescription or observation that far too many individuals are being stopped, particularly African American and Hispanic drivers are being stopped for minor traffic enforcements on a fishing expedition to see if there's something else more involved. So we established, after years of looking at this and reviewing and trying to find the right spot of where is proactive policing looking for individuals that are preying upon neighborhoods, committing crimes, particularly crimes of violence, versus an individual who's got tinted windows or perhaps has an ornament in his windshield or no front plate, and officer is just stopping as a fishing expedition. And we established this pretext stop policy last March. The Board of Police Commissioners actually established it. And it says that the pretext stop policy, it authorizes it, but only when, on minor equipment violations, the officer has added information about a crime that's of serious importance to a neighborhood. And what we've seen is our officers, as they've now are following that, is we've seen a substantial reduction in the number of traffic stops involving equipment violations to the tune of 61,000 fewer traffic stops overall, of which 54,000, this is just since April, involve equipment violations. That's 90%. In those 90% of the total traffic stops, to be plain, simple English, we're seeing a reduction of officers being overly reliant on minor equipment violations in which to see, is there something more at hand here? Now, having said that, the impact has been 61% fewer African Americans and 53% fewer Hispanics have been stopped because of that change. And yet, at the same time, we recovered more than 100 weapons, firearms, from individuals who were stopped on a minor equipment violation, but the officer had added information about robberies that were occurring in the area with a vehicle description, or burglaries that were occurring, or other serious crimes in which they're stopping under a pretext for a more serious offense.
Let me ask you point blank whether or not LAPD profiles black and brown motorists in this city.
I know there's a belief that we do. I know as an organization, there's no tolerance for racial or any type of bias of that sense, gender bias, racial bias, and any evidence of it in the organization would be handled and is handled in a harsh manner, in a disciplinary manner. There's no place in the Los Angeles Police Department for a racist, and yet we hire from our communities, and communities of all colors and all walks of life. And as they come into the organization, we strive to screen out those that have racist or other improper biases such as that. And if there's any evidence that we find over the course of an officer's career that they've developed those views and their practices are based on those views, then they're going to be eliminated.
You're listening to KBLA Talk 1580. I'm Tavis Smiley. He is LAPD Chief Michael Moore. We are pleased to have him in studio for the hour to talk about why he wants and deserves, has earned a second 5-year term, and interrogate his record over the first 5 years. We continue that conversation right now. I should mention, by the way, that the new sheriff, Robert Luna, will be our guest on this program next Wednesday at 9 a.m. Honored to have the chief of police for LAPD today, and Sheriff Luna will be our guest on this program at 9 a.m. Next Wednesday. You said a moment ago, Chief Moore, that there is no place for racists in the police department. We know that you recently passed a policy prohibiting the flying of the Blue Lives Matter flag at LAP divisions or on officer uniforms, patrol cars, etc. You mentioned, though, recently at a commission hearing that you do fly the flag at your home. Help me understand why you fly it at your home. You have forbidden it in other places, and what we, everyday people, are to make of this Blue Lives Matter flag in the first place.
So first of all, it's the thin blue line flag. It's not the Blue Lives Matter flag. I think that the phrasing of that latter part, the Blue Lives Matter, has been, unfortunately, this divisive environment in which someone is building off of a Black Lives Matter or All Lives Matter, and they're trying to phrase something that is communicating a message that is unclear. The thin blue line is a flag design. It's a United States flag. It's a black and white stripes. It has the stars and stripes of our nation's colors. They've been changed generally to be a black and white, and one of the lines, one of the stripes is blue. It came from a red line flag of more than 100 years ago, dealing with the battles involving redcoats. And then it changed to blue coats over the years as the Union soldier against the Confederate soldier. And then it changed again in the last 100 years to be reflective of the blue line of law enforcement, of public safety. Now, there's also renditions of this as a red line flag goes for fire. There's a green line flag that goes to support the men and women that work in our armed forces. Those three that I've just described, the thin blue line for law enforcement, the red line for fire, and the green line for armed forces, are meant to be symbols to the dedication, sacrifice, the valor of those three branches of what keeps us safe, what keeps this democracy alive. And make no mistake about it, I will defend that meaning of that flag as I'll defend the cross as a Christian, because that is the symbolism to me. Now, having said that, most recently and more recently, divisive extremist groups that are trying to garner support and suggest to others that law enforcement supports them has hijacked both symbols I've just spoke about, the thin blue line as well as the Christian cross, to be representative of their extremist views, of their white supremacist views, of their Proud Boy views, of their 3% views. So when you walk into, if you come up to my home, and I have that flag as I have our nation's colors flag, and I fly it out front, it's a context of supporting what I think the vast majority of Americans see that thin blue line flag to mean, which is support of law enforcement. But I wouldn't, and if I were to display a Christian cross, it's because the generally held thought this man's a Christian or this family is. However, in our front lobbies, it's a place that should be apolitical. It should be a place of safety and comfort, and it shouldn't be a place where there's any question about the context of what that flag means, because there are people today that see the thin blue line flag as being representative of these extremist views. So I didn't establish a new policy. I didn't establish a policy, whether it be wearing a thin blue line flag on your uniform or in our front lobby. Those policies have been in existence for years. But an issue came up where we had a community member that said in the Rampart station that there was such a flag displayed in the front lobby. Now, the lobbies of our front lobbies should have and does have a United States flag. And our officers, as I do and have for years, wear a United States flag, because that's what we want. Every item on this uniform is here for a reason. And I don't want any confusion about what it is, any more than my predecessors have. Now, I recognize that this assertion of removing that flag because it was unauthorized from the lobby caused a great deal of consternation from our people about whether I supported and were loyal to them. And I apologize to them for that, because I mean to support them. And I dedicate my life to the service of the city, and that includes the men and women in their sacrifice.
I'm watching my time here and just trying to make sure we cover as much ground as we can in the time that we have, so I didn't want to interrupt. But I'm just trying to cover more ground here. Let me just say this right quick before we move on. Perception is reality for many of us, as you well know, number one. Number two, I hear your distinction on the flag and the cross, and I'm okay with that so long as we don't put the flag above the cross,
of course,
which many people did on January 6th. Hold on to that. I'm coming back to that in just a second, Chief. But I want you, how do I want to phrase this? If you want us to appreciate the distinction you've just made about the thin blue line versus Blue Lives Matter as a symbol, can you appreciate the distinction that some make in the Black Lives Matter movement when they say defund the police and reimagining how we do policing? We get caught up in these phrases and these words and these symbols, and just like you want us to understand that distinction, can you understand when people say defund the police? And I'm not arguing for that. I'm just asking you if you can see it one way, can you see it the other way? This distinction between defunding the police as a slogan and the notion of reimagining how we police. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I believe that, this great country of ours, this experiment, has been built on debate and has been built on arguments and viewpoints, but its success has been our ability to find common ground and our ability to understand and hear each other. Bill Bratton once said, years ago, that we all talk a lot, but can we hear each other? Mm-hmm. And I think when I hear defund the police, there are people who mean to abolish the police. They mean defund, abolish, take down the entire structure and organization. I'm not aware of any democracy in the world where there's not local police, where there's not state police, that there's not a policing function.
But there's also no democracy in the world where police kill more people than they do in this country.
But the point of what I'm trying to make, though, is, so I have difficulty with people who want to abolish the police. But defund the police to many other people does mean, and I can interpret it, as reimagining and finding alternatives. Mm-hmm. Why are the police officers the go-to? Why are we the 911 for every social emergency in America? And just as I spoke to another reporter earlier today about these mass shootings, mm-hmm. and how do we stop them? And he says, well, do we need more laws? Do we need more enforcement? Do we need more cops? No, we need more mental health. We need more alternatives to policing. When you have a gunman who goes out and kills 11 people, shoots 9 others, another gunman that goes and kills 7 people in a matter of hours, and these are not the only mass shootings. When we see violence in our street and people being shot and killed over a gesture on social media, we need better social systems, better social programming, and more support and more investment in that. Now, people will get into a binary scenario that says, well, then that means we need to take it from the police. Mm-hmm. I believe that where the complexities of society requires complex solutions, which again is why I'm encouraged by Mayor Bass and her administration looking at this thorny issue of homelessness, and that what are the things that are going to solve it. First of all, it's going to be housing, interim as well as long term, but there's also important work that needs to be done in mental health, important work that needs to be done in ensuring that people don't become homeless to begin with. Policing and public safety is the same, that these are not issues of just one or the other, but they're complex and they're interwoven.
What should the relationship be between LAPD and persons who are unhoused, homeless persons? What should that role be between the police and those who we know who have mental illness issues?
Well, the role between policing and persons experiencing homelessness, our primary role is to, like the rest of the city government and really all of government, which is how do we find avenues, how do we find strategies and resources so that they're no longer exposed to the elements, they're no longer in the dangerous environments of being homeless, mm-hmm. they're no longer in the rabbit hole of despair, of mental health and social and substance abuse, and that's the primary issues. How can we help coordinate or reach out and organize so people can give and provide services that are going to transition this person out of this homelessness state. Now, is there an enforcement role? There absolutely is. There's a role when you have persons who are experiencing homelessness that are involved in human trafficking, in narcotic trafficking, when they're preying upon neighborhoods and committing violence and property crime. Being homeless is not an allowance, again, for you to go out and ignore societal rules about the rights of others. And so that's where law enforcement's appropriate role is. Last year, 82 people were victims of homicide experiencing homelessness. And to everyone that has been solved, nearly every offender was also experiencing homelessness. Now, for us, the role of the criminal investigation is to solve that crime and to bring some justice, some measure of justice to that individual's families and friends and others. But the real social ills, the things that allowed that situation to deteriorate, where you have that level of violence and loss of life in a homeless encampment, those are issues much larger than law enforcement. And law enforcement's role there is to frankly point to those deficiencies and try to find a bully pulpit of means of support so the public will provide the housing, the necessary resources to change those circumstances.
I was looking through my notes here. As you saw me I was searching for something. I'm trying to find. I have it here somewhere. You'll take my point. I don't need the exact number because you know what it is. Speaking of defunding the police, I didn't want to get too far away from that. The LAPD budget continues to grow and grow and grow and grow. Eric Garcetti said publicly as mayor after the death of George Floyd that he was going to basically cut that budget. It really didn't quite happen that way. He didn't cut the budget of LAPD. The city council did not cut the budget of LAPD. You've asked for even more money in the next budget for LAPD. So back to this notion of defunding the police, the answer may not be to abolish police departments, and the answer may not be to defund police departments, but why does LAPD need the lion's share? Why do they deserve the lion's share of our taxpayer dollars?
Well, let me make a couple of distinctions. If one only needs to look to our staffing levels in 2019, both of our sworn and civilian rankings, and now look at them today. Now, the cost of employment today, much as I'm sure many of your listeners know, is higher. Doesn't matter you have more. Doesn't mean you have more people. Actually, the people are just more expensive. That's not just city government. That's all of us as a society. We're paying more today for labor than we did just 3 or 4 years ago. Secondly, we're paying more for goods. Cost of gasoline today is much different than it was 3 or 4 years ago.
You're telling me.
So to that end, the monetary number may be rising, but the staffing number has gone from 10,000 sworn members working the streets to 9,222. It's gone from 3,150 civilian personnel working things like our 911 communications, our custody services, administrative positions, critical positions, our scientific investigation division that tests blood, alcohol, and so forth. That's dropped from 3,100 to 2,650. Those are, when you put those two numbers together, more than 1,000 fewer personnel today working in this department for the safety of Los Angeles than it was just 3 years ago. Now, we can look at the numbers and say, well, but the cost of this went up, so you're continuing to invest and grow the Los Angeles Police Department. No, quite the contrary. In fact, that's why I'm encouraged by Mayor Bass's commitment to restore a portion of that cutback, because they represent critical services that we are no longer being able to investigate and involve in. Lastly, there's this constant drumbeat about how much of the city government, how much of the city's funds the Los Angeles Police Department represents. And they conveniently play with the math. When you look at what it takes to run the Los Angeles World Airports, what it takes to run the Department of Water and Power, what it takes to run the Port Authority, those funds are not costed into the quote-unquote budget. When we look at what's called the general fund, that's what's left after you fund all the proprietary departments, when you fund all the special designated areas, such as libraries and other services, and then you have what's left as a general fund. And yes, we do make up 51, 52% of that, but it's not of the city's total budget. The city's total budget is in the area of 12, 13, 14 billion dollars. So while our representation that we represent from the general fund, it's what is left after these other primary funds are met. So it's a bit of statistics, it's a bit of gamesmanship, but I will lastly close. Angelenos need to know today that as a department, we have realigned, we've reimagined, we've offloaded and shifting and look to shift more resources, look to shift more responsibilities from us to other alternatives to policing, because it's what we believe is efficient and effective, but also it's what's needed given the workforce that we have today.
Since we mentioned BLM and mentioned this notion of defunding the police, let me just ask this question right quick. I want to move on. I got 15 minutes left and a lot more ground to cover with you, Chief, and I thank you again for your time, sir. Melina Abdullah is not just a personal friend of mine, a sister friend of mine. She is also a host on this station. Black Lives Matter has a program called This Is Not a Drill that airs Saturdays and Sundays here on KBLA Talk 1580. We're honored to have her as a colleague. And let me just say to you face-to-face, honest, man-to-man, I thought it was an embarrassment for LAPD, frankly, to be swatting her house multiple times. What was that about?
Well, there was 4 calls, and they occurred in August of 2020. A year later, there was 3 additional calls, and the last 2 actually occurred about 17 minutes apart. And each of these calls, the call went to our non-emergency number. So like a 911 call, but it's a 7-digit number that still gets you to a 911 operator. And the report was of an individual gunman that was holding the family members hostage at rifle point, at gunpoint, demanding, as I recall, a ransom, but essentially a scenario that required our response. And we went to we went to the house, went to the location, and we attempted to make contact, and we eventually made contact with, I believe it was Miss Abdullah and other instances, perhaps other members that were there. Mm-hmm. Our effort was to de-escalate that as soon as we were able to determine that in fact, it was a false alarm, that it was, quote unquote, a swatting. Now, to those that are on the broadcast that may not know what that term means, it occurs when it's a phenomenon that's existed for about the last 20 years, where people are able to use technology and represent themselves as someone else and call on that person's behalf. And someone will replicate themselves as, say, Michael Moore, call from my home and report that as chief of police I'm being held hostage by some group. And it's generally inflammatory, it's very stark, and it's very daunting. And you listen to it and you go, oh my gosh, there's an emergency in progress. So law enforcement will respond. And we go to those locations to try
But this not to cut you off, Chief, but this happened 3 or 4 times, though.
Yes.
Your intel has to be better than that.
Well, it happened once in August, and then it went an entire year. And in September, it happened the 3 additional times. Now, what we found was that, in fact, they were investigated by major crimes, immediately turned to them, is that this was a organized effort by a professional group offshore. They used technology such as the IP address of the phone call came from the United Kingdom.
So it was a hoax.
And it was a hoax, but it was not just a hoax for her.
Right.
The same group was involved in a hoax in Missouri, in Phoenix, in Kansas City, and in New York City. And these can be viewed as, well, why can't law enforcement know that on the front side? Mm-hmm. And the reality of the matter is because some of these things turn out to be true.
Let's talk about transparency then, since we seem to be moving in that direction, about greater transparency for LAPD. And let me just ask you point blank why you won't release the names of those officers who participated in that January 6th attempted coup at the Capitol. We know they were there. Why don't you release their names?
Well, because there was not a member. Let me be ultimately absolutely clear. State my reputation on this. Mm-hmm. There was not a single member of the Los Angeles Police Department, sworn or civilian, that was at the January 6th insurrection. Period. Mm-hmm. That's been fully investigated. We've cooperated, and the FBI has investigated that. And the FBI has identified members of the military as well as law enforcement and fire services that were active, that were there, and were on the Capitol grounds or inside the Capitol. I recognize the accusation. And we did have 4 individuals that were in Washington, D.C. At the political rally, and their movements were tracked and verified that they never stepped foot anywhere near the Capitol grounds.
Does it trouble you that they were? I hear that distinction. It's in some ways, it's respectfully, it's a distinction without a difference. I hear your point, and I accept it. But does it trouble you that they were at the rally even?
As
4 of your members?
Well, 4 of the department went to the political rally of the sitting president of the United States of the Republic, who represents at that time the lead of the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. And I recognize how divisive he has been, and I recognize the turmoil in our political systems. But it was a protected First Amendment right, and it's what makes this country great. Is that people who we can differ with over their political views, they're still Americans. Yeah. And they still have the right to go lawfully and express themselves. Now, we watch for extremist behaviors in any political ideology, and that's across both sides of the aisle and the entire political spectrum.
But my question was, does that personally concern you, that 4 of your members, you just talked earlier about this thin blue line, you want to support your guys, your gals, your officers, does it bother you that 4 of your members were at that rally?
No, what bothers me is the continued...
It does not bother you?
No, because they're, as Americans, they get to lawfully express their political views in the discord of what we call this the debate of where we're going as a country. What bothers me is painting them in the extremists that actually did the insurrection. There are many good Americans that, including those individuals, I believe, that did not support the activities of attempting to interrupt or stop that electoral college certification. If I believed that any of them supported that, then I would seek their removal.
Let me ask you some questions that are it's a great thing about talk radio. I ask the questions, you answer, and the audience decides whether or not they accept your answers, or how they perceive your responses. That's up to them. Let me ask you. I got 10 minutes left for you. I want to cover some more ground here, and thank you again for the time. I want to ask you some inside baseball questions, some inside LAPD questions, if I can put it that way. Question number one: in 2020. The OJB, the Oscar Joe Bryant Foundation for Black Officers, documented a post-George Floyd surge in anti-black themes on LAPD officers' social media sites. They met with you, I am told, requested that you do an independent workplace climate assessment by experts to determine if black, female, and other marginalized officers were facing hostile work environments in LAPD. My question is simply this: did OJB's request for an independent assessment get done? And if so, what did it say?
Yeah, I meet regularly with OGB as well as ABLE and LeLay and other employee affiliated groups, and my recollection is they did not ask, and we did and will continue to evaluate social media traffic of our membership. So an independent cultural assessment, if you will, within the organization of extremist views and racist views, that was not something that they asked for.
So I'm gonna be clear. Your recollection is that they did not ask for an independent investigation.
Well, we did an independent investigation of there were social media posts that were found to be racist, that were found to be improper, and in each instance we pursued not just the investigation, but took disciplinary action for anyone that we could that are using social media, representing themselves as a member of this department, and made a racist or sexist view to punish them, including to seek their removal. So that is something that I have done, and I will continue to do, because an officer's on and off duty conduct is to remain unsullied, and espousing racist or homophobic or other discriminatory views and identifying as a member of this department will get you fired.
So I heard the point you made earlier, that you personally didn't have a problem with those 4 officers being at the rally on January 6th. My question now, though, is why for years has LAPD allowed Trump posters to be displayed in officers' cubicles?
We haven't allowed for years. There's been instances of reported times in which Trump, or for that matter, other presidential candidates and other elected office seekers, in which a member of the organization has sought to place a banner or place a sticker or some type, and those are not allowed in the workplace. And in the rarity in which that has happened, we've taken action to have it removed. We had somebody at a division about a year ago, 9 months ago, that posted a candidate for mayor banner on a grassway. There was a complaint. There was disciplinary action taken against that employee. That was wrong. And it didn't matter whether that person's the mayor now or not. The point of the matter is that the government is the most visible form of government, being police officers, that our political views are just ours, and they're not to reflect the Los Angeles Police Department.
There are many in this city who feel that LAPD can't do a good enough job doesn't do a good enough job of distinguishing between largely peaceful protest and violent insurrections. Do you think your department can make that distinction between those two things and not harass protesters in the city?
Absolutely. I think we do it every single day. There's thousands of protests that occur across the course of a year in this city, which will never make the nightly news. We'll never see an enforcement action by the department. We'll never see riotous conditions. We'll never see officers injured, attempt murder of police officers. We'll never see the burning of black and whites or buses. We'll never see the looting or incursion into retail sectors. The vast majority of demonstrations in this city I'm proud of, which is that they go about themselves in an organized manner that allow us in Department of Transportation and Fire to facilitate. There's times in which there's inconvenience to the motoring public. There's times in which portions of our city are deadlocked in the sense of traffic being able to move because people are taking to the roadway to have their views heard. But in those instances, those may make someone's annoyance, but the police department's there to facilitate and to allow. There are instances in which that falls short, but I believe that the lessons learned from the 2020 civil unrest were lessons about how to refine and improve, but I also will stand by the actions of our officers, which were under assault with rocks and other types of deadly items.
We got 5 minutes left here. Now,
Sure.
Thank you once again for coming in studio. Speaking of the motoring public, I researched this last night because I specifically wanted to ask you about this. Dr. Rod Chetty of the Harvard Business School established that as a result of LAPD mass suppression tactics on any given day, that a black man aged 18 to 24, listen to this, Chief, a black man aged 18 to 24 steps out of his unit in Nickerson Gardens housing project, facing a 45% risk of going to jail, an 80% risk of being stopped, and a 70% risk over a lifetime of going to state prison. Obviously, these numbers, as I was reading last night, are staggering for me. Is this what LAPD tactics intend?
No, I think that the embarrassing aspect of that study speaks to the crisis that we have in that neighborhood for the lack of services, the lack of resources, the life of despair that too often results and becomes multi-generational.
Mm-hmm.
Why the Community Safety Partnership was formed more than a decade ago was to assign officers that would stay in those areas for 5 years and would work not through an enforcement means, but through figuring out why in a country rich with such resources and having so many, we put a man on the moon, we're heading to Mars,
Mm-hmm.
but we can't provide shelter, we can't provide social services and programming, education and jobs, where those stats become the reality. So we become, as a result, the societal control factor of now exercising, because a person who's in this hopeless despair falls out of the societal norms and goes down a path of violence against others and committing crimes and so forth. What I'm proud about is that Community Safety Partnership has shown, through reducing violence, improving the quality of life, and the support and trust of policing with fewer arrests, that it's not the police that matter, though we do. It's the work of the police in those communities to knit together all of the government, community, faith, and others, and the community members themselves, to build resiliency and to build a future out of that type of despair.
I've got 3 questions left I want to ask. We might be a little late on news and traffic and sports at the top, but let me just get these last few questions out, and I'll let you get out of here and get back to doing what you need to be doing, protecting the citizens of this city. There is a low level of confidence. The numbers bear this out. You see the same numbers I do. I don't need to cite them for this conversation, but a low level of confidence in law enforcement. And to my mind, Chief, that ultimately leads to a threat to civil society. What say you broadly about the low numbers of trust and confidence in LAPD by the citizenry?
So I want to update America, particularly Los Angeles. Our numbers are improving.
Mm-hmm.
While we have more work to be done, 3 out of 4 Angelenos want to see more police officers in their neighborhoods. Mayor Bass has spoken about the fact that she moves around the city and she's going to conduct a neighborhood by neighborhood community survey to understand where are those neighbors that want to see a more visible presence of uniformed officers. Trust in police have raised and across all demographics. I refer your readers and listeners to the most recent LMU study that was completed last August that talked about the study completed last year and the study completed in 2020. And what you see is an improvement in our standing well above the media and well above local government. And as we looked at that with some optimism, recognizing we have more work to be done. We're not there, but we're also not spiraling in a downward fashion. We are contend with good, effective policing strategies, with a commitment and humility, with confidence that we matter, that our people are dedicated, they're working out every day to do their very best in a difficult environment, in an imperfect society, that if we work together, we'll make mistakes. When we mess up, we need to own it, and that means also people messing up where they need to be punished. But overall, I believe that we have a brighter future in front of us if we pull together and find ways of common ground rather than our differences.
As I said, 3 questions to go. Now we're down to 2.
Okay.
These 2 questions matter to this audience. You know where you are, obviously, so it matters to this audience. What did LAPD learn about that break-in during the campaign at Karen Bass's house?
Well, we learned that 2 individuals were responsible as burglars, breaking into her home. They stole a firearm out of there, and they committed a common day residential burglary. I'm grateful that through the use of some technology of a license plate reader, they were able to identify the vehicle that was involved. We were able to identify the individuals, and they were arrested and they brought before the criminal justice system. We also learned that Mayor Bass was a victim, that she was there, and I'm sure it startled her as it would me if my home was broken into.
And finally, because again, it matters to this audience, we all know full well that audio tape that was leaked with those members of the city council, 3 of them, one of them still there, and Ron Herrera, former labor leader, saying some pretty disparaging things about the African-American community and beyond. I know you won't divulge what you cannot divulge, but what's up with that investigation? Where are we at with that on the leaked audio tape?
So that's an investigation of electronic trail. Mm-hmm. We're following breadcrumbs to figure out, from the point of where it's put in the public space, can we figure out through following breadcrumbs the electronic trail back to its origin? It's much like with Melina Abdullah's swatting cases, where depending on the level of sophistication of the people who committed that crime of the eavesdropping, whether they were able to effectively shield or wash their identity. We're not there yet to say that, but our pursuit to the public must also be framed in the sense that we're not conducting this investigation in any effort to shield or support the terrible things that were said and representative of people's motives in that meeting. There is no defending of that. But at the same time, we have a responsibility to understand in this federation, with its tremendous influence with labor, was this recording part of a larger scheme of some type of public corruption or extortion? What was that, in which we hear one aspect, but the Federation, I believe, is on the record, and I believe that this was not the only recording that was done, and we're trying to understand the larger issues that may be involved.
Did I hear you correctly? You believe there are other recordings?
Based on I do believe this was that there are other recordings, yes. Based on the investigation I have, it's my belief. Whether I can prove it or demonstrate it is something different.
I am 3 minutes past the time you promised me. I am indebted to you. I'm grateful to you for coming to spend this time with us. I'll give the last word to you. What say you, Chief Michael Moore, to the citizens of this city, to the police commission, to the mayor, the city council, about why you should be given a second 5-year term? The microphone's yours, sir.
Well, I believe that my past tells the future, and it means that a future that has promise, but also a future that demonstrates a man that recognizes that policing the city is a difficult job. It's a profession that requires humility at times, and also confidence that our work matters. I have my goals: to reduce gun violence, to expand the community safety partnership, to restore our workforce, to build greater numbers so we can do a better job, get our response time down, get 911 calls answered in a more timely fashion. It's to build and modernize our technology. It's also to deepen our training to ensure that we can and do de-escalate at every opportunity. And finally, it's succession and for the future of this city, to build and continue to build a workforce that will lead us to the next decade and beyond, and prepare us for world-class events such as the 2026 World Games and the 2028 Summer Olympics and Paralympics. And I'm proud to have the privilege to have that opportunity.
I'm sorry to step on you, Chief Michael Moore. Thank you for keeping your word. You promised you'd come see me, and you did. Yep. You promised an hour. You stayed for an hour and 5 minutes, so I thank you for the extra 5 minutes. I thank you for listening. That's our show for today. Time now for the KBLA Midday Money Chain. Up next, the Millionaires Roundtable with Lynn Richardson, followed by Ahead of the Crypto Curve with Najee Roberts. Old money, new money, it don't matter. We got you covered around here on KBLA Talk 1580. Our thanks once again to LAPD Chief Michael Moore. And thank you for tuning in, and forgive us for being a little late into this hour. But we appreciate you being here. And as always, keep the faith.
KBLA 1580 Santa Monica.